Vikram Nehru, you're Director of Poverty Reduction and Economic Management for the World Bank in East Asia. At the moment, we're seeing the poor under great stress because of what's happening with oil and food prices. And presumably we're seeing the absolute numbers of the poor increasing and the gulf between rich and poor increasing as well.
Well, first of all, East Asia has had a tremendous record of poverty reduction. In fact, the best in the world. For the last 30 years, East Asia has had a very rapid growth rate, and as a result, poverty has declined very substantially, most significantly in China, but also in countries like Indonesia and Vietnam and so forth. So the record on poverty reduction is really very impressive. However, having said that, we've had over the last couple of years a run-up in food prices, which frankly I don't think the world has seen before. It's been such an incredibly rapid run-up, and the implication for the poor has been quite significant. Now, our estimate worldwide is that over the 2 years, about 100 million additional people have been pushed into poverty as a result of rising food prices. In countries like Indonesia alone, an increase of 10% in the price of food leads to an increase of 2 million people into poverty. So these are worrying numbers. They should give considerable concern to everybody in the world, and it points to the fact that a lot needs to be done on two counts. First, on helping the poor meet the challenge of obtaining food and to be protected against these high food prices. But secondly, the longer term challenge of increasing agricultural production worldwide. I think for quite a long time now, the world has not emphasized agricultural production as perhaps it should have, and there is a need for increased investment in agricultural research, in irrigation, in new seeds, in new technology, and I think the world has now realized this lacuna, and I think a lot of effort is going to be made to correct it in the future.
But how can governments, not just within Asia but around the world, how can governments in the short term deal with rising food prices? Are you thinking in terms of subsidies?
Well, the most important thing that governments can do is to protect the poor from rising food prices. So the focus should be on the poor. Therefore, we would not recommend blanket subsidies because they tend to be very costly. But what we do recommend is that governments target transfers of resources from the budget to the poor. That's certainly one means by which the poor can be protected, but it's not the only means. In many parts of the world, school feeding programs have been very effective in making sure that children who are particularly vulnerable don't suffer from malnutrition or shortages of food in the house, so they come to the school and they get a full meal at school. An alternative, which has also been found to be useful in such situations, is food for work, where the very poor are able to work in order to get a daily ration of food, which at least provides them with minimal amounts of nutrition so that they can keep body and soul together until the situation improves. So there are a range of instruments which governments have to target assistance to the poor, because that is the key point, to make sure that the poor don't suffer from such a run-up in food prices.
And governments are going to have to act quickly, because essentially you're seeing protests related to food.
Yes, indeed. Protests in a large number of countries, but governments are acting rather quickly. We've just seen Indonesia introduce an important transfer program to 19 million households, and given that each household is roughly 4.5 people, that's about a third of the population of Indonesia. That's quite a remarkable feat, and let's see how it gets implemented, but I have every confidence that it will be implemented well. And similar sorts of programs are being introduced, not perhaps on such a wide scale, but similar sorts of programs are being introduced in other parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, and so forth.
Recent news from the World Bank is that the World Bank is going to offer financial help in a sort of food aid package worth $1.2 billion. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
The World Bank's Executive Board has just approved a $1.2 billion fast-track facility, which is basically a facility which provides funding quickly when there is a need to assist governments to put in place programs that help protect the poor from food price increases. Now, of this $1.2 billion, $200 million has been provided by the World Bank itself for grant arrangements, and the first 3 grants are in fact going to be discussed immediately, very soon, to countries such as Haiti, Liberia and Djibouti, very poor countries in a very desperate situation. But other countries that could also be assisted very quickly are countries like Tajikistan and so forth. This facility is designed to be a part of a broader effort by the international community, including the World Food Programme, to provide assistance as quickly as possible so that resources are not the constraint for ensuring that assistance reaches the poor. That's the immediate effort. The longer term effort, however, as I mentioned, is to increase agricultural investments for long-term increases in agricultural production. There, the World Bank has been lending around $4 billion a year, but the President has just announced, the President of the World Bank has just announced that we'll increase this to about $6 billion next year and perhaps even more the year after. So there's going to be a substantial effort there as well. And this will be part of a broader effort by the international community to invest about $30 billion a year in increased agricultural investment in the poor countries.
How serious would you say this problem is at the moment? I mean, are we really facing a crisis in terms of food shortages?
This is a very serious problem. It's a very serious problem, but it's also like a silent tsunami in the sense that there's no dramatic footage that can bring home to people the misery and the human suffering that such price increases can exert on the poor. So this is a very serious problem, and it's very serious for the reason that the increase in food prices, doubling or tripling of important food grains such as wheat and rice, is really unprecedented. It's never happened before, and what makes it worse is that on previous occasions when food prices have climbed, they've always come down very rapidly. But this time we don't expect food prices to come down very soon. We expect, in fact, food prices to remain elevated, perhaps not at these high levels, but certainly higher than in the past, for at least another 10 years or so. So this is not just a big problem today, but it's likely to persist for some time to come, which is why it's so important to help the poor immediately, but at the same time put in place longer term programs to deal with the more significant underlying problem which has led to this situation.
And the longer term solutions are to invest more in agriculture?
To invest more in agricultural research, in seeds, in technology, in extension, and of course in irrigation. And finally, in introducing systems that help farmers manage risk mitigation instruments. For example, to allow them to purchase insurance against drought or against floods. These are very costly events that occur in the lives of farmers, and at this point there are very few financial instruments they have available to protect themselves, and the World Bank is working hard to introduce such instruments in some countries.
This must be a setback for poverty reduction initiatives and efforts.
This is a setback. There's no question about it. And if prices continue to rise, it will pose even bigger and bigger problems. But the important point to remember is that one of the most powerful drivers of poverty reduction has been economic growth. And if countries continue to grow as they have, not just in East Asia, incidentally, in Africa and other countries, then poverty can continue to come down even as we deal with the high price of food. But the reality is that we're going to have to try and bring down poverty over the long term by a combination of broad economic growth as well as investments in agricultural production.
Vikram Nehru, thanks for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you for having me.